Tonight, a question to drift on. What if the gentlest medicine on a Paris pharmacy shelf in 1925 was the hardest drug we fear today? What if a cough syrup sold with a smile on the Champs-Élysées quietly rewired the brightest minds of a generation? Welcome to Silent History. If slow, careful storytelling helps you unwind, you can tap like. It truly helps the channel. And I'm curious, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our night owl map light up across the world. Now, dim the lights, unclench your jaw, and let the day fall away. We're going to Paris when the brightest rooms had the darkest bottles. Paris, 1925. The city hums like a well-tuned instrument. Tram bells sigh. Café doors exhale roasted air. On the wide boulevards, polished shoes lift and set down in confident rhythm. The evening has that soft Parisian trick. It looks like dusk and feels like morning, everything beginning again. Step into any respectable pharmacy. You'll smell lavender soap and wood polish, the glass-clean chill of counters lined with neat, obedient bottles. Aspirin here, sleeping salts there, tonics for nervous strain. And one graceful vial with a brave name that sits so confidently under the light, it might be a miniature lighthouse. Its label promises calm. Its clerk promises sleep. A sedative for coughs, they say, with a reassuring tilt of the head. Just a teaspoon with tea. People trust the bottle because they trust the room. The white coat, the ledger with elegant handwriting, the counter where coins and comfort trade places. Glass looks honest. Latin sounds wise. Paris blesses everything with reason. You can buy it across from a museum, beside a florist, steps from a shop that sells the best fountain pens, a civilized street, a civilized cure, a city that believes in medicine, in progress, in the gentle victory of chemistry over suffering. Who would imagine that victory would come with a cost you can't pay in francs? Writers arrive on the boat train with cheap rents circled in their notebooks and a stubborn shimmer of purpose in their eyes. They are fierce with ambition and tender with doubt, which Paris seems built to shelter. Mornings are for pages, afternoons for walking, evenings for conversation, the soft duel between confidence and fear. Someone coughs. Someone else confesses a new insomnia where thoughts pace all night in tight, clever circles. A friend, trying to help, offers a light word. There's a medicine for that. The first dose is a courtesy. A hush pressed onto the nerves. The breath seems to find new rooms inside the chest. The floor beneath the feet steadies and widens. Colors cooperate. Thoughts line up at the edge of the page as if the mind has taught them manners. The writer who could not land a sentence all morning suddenly watches paragraphs arrive like obedient doves. It feels like a fair trade, a small stream of relief in exchange for a small spoon of amber. You promise yourself you'll save it for bad days. The calendar, patient and cunning, learns a new language. A bad day becomes a day without the hush. The body remembers quiet and begins petitioning for it, politely at first, the way a bookshelf leans a little more each week. You don't notice the angle until a book slips off on its own. Pharmacies develop a kind memory, too. Clerks recognize foreigners who ask by brand name. They wrap the bottle tenderly, as if shielding the buyer from the wind. Receipts fold into squares that feel smaller than the price. Outside, the vial rides home in a coat pocket, close to the heart, which miraculously beats more calmly now, until it doesn't. No one means harm, not the chemist who stands under a lamp until his eyes ache, chasing a molecule toward mercy. Not the doctor who believes kind relief is the same as safe relief. Not the patient who wants to write or sleep or swallow without pain. Progress often begins as an honest mistake carried confidently. Paris can carry anything confidently. By midsummer, café talk sounds softer at the edges. Arguments that once crackled now drift like smoke rings. Pages fill more slowly, but feel, somehow, more profound in the moment of writing. A painter praises the sudden sincerity of blue. A poet wonders earnestly if time has always been this wide. A musician hears a melody like a room with one window opening and closing on a tide of breath. A few things shift in ways only the careful notice. People sit longer, move later, forget to finish. The light inside certain eyes seems to come from farther away, as if the face were a telescope and the soul has stepped back from the eyepiece. Laughter lands with velvet weight and does not bounce. Doctors begin writing small notes to themselves, cautious, private, humble lines that read like this. Patient returned earlier than expected. No cough. Requests continued relief for restlessness. The word addiction has not yet learned the route to their mouths. They say habit, dependence, or nothing at all. They recommend a smaller spoon, a slower taper, a brisk walk, a little courage. Supply does not taper just because conscience does. Behind the bright counters, far behind, in rooms with ledgers and 2 locks on the door, someone has solved the question of how much. Enough to meet demand, enough to prevent disappointment, enough that the polite bottle never has to say we are out. When one source falters, another appears with the handsome efficiency of modern commerce. Up in Montmartre, the hill shows its ribs through the streets. Painters lean canvases to dry. Pigeons write small, undecipherable letters on the square. You can still find the old Bohemia if you know where to look, but there is a new economy too, quieter than a market, more profitable than a sketch. Studio doors that once opened to turpentine and coffee now exhale the metallic sweet of flame on a spoon. No one calls themselves a dealer at first. They are helping friends with overhead, sharing medicine at cost. They keep tidy notebooks the way artists do, dates, initials, amounts, remarks that read like marginalia in the story of a nervous system. If you didn't know better, you'd think it was a color chart. If you didn't know better, you might envy the order. Music lengthens almost imperceptibly. Jazz arrived as a spark and begins to smolder. Tempos stretch, rubber bands warmed by a match. The bassist learns to sound like a heartbeat, learning to fall asleep. The trumpeter leans into a note until it changes shape around his breath. The room strains toward the sound, like flowers turning to a window. When the song ends, no one claps right away. Not out of rudeness, out of spell. In a salon off Avenue Foch, a hostess who has perfected the art of effortless perfection pours tea. Nobody drinks. Someone requests the medicine for stage nerves, though no one here has a stage. A discreet physician arrives at 9, leaves at 9:15, and never uses the front door. He does not judge. In his mind, he is preventing worse. Paris has always made small, civilized compromises. Language adapts slower than habit. The words we have decide the choices we can see. As long as this bottle is medicine, as long as relief is treatment, as long as the ritual remains civilized, everything else can remain fine. That is how a culture crosses a winter river. It calls the ice ground as long as it can. There are diaries, too, the honest documents people write when their performance is tired. margins that confess what sentences can't carry. I work better with it, except I do not work. I feel more myself, except I do not finish anything myself. My calm is borrowed, my credit poor. Those lines never reach the café table. They stay in drawers with scarves and letters from home. A rumor travels lightly. A German company has adjusted its ambitions. The easy bottles are less easy to order. Rumor is not a stoppage. It is a rerouting. Other hands, clever, worldly, untroubled by white coats, discover they can carry the same river in other channels. For the person with the pocket, nothing changes. The glass is still glass. The hush is still hush. Paris is resilient. That is one of its virtues and one of its dangers. It can make tragedy look like fashion if you squint. It can hum a warning in lullaby tempo until the city drifts to sleep beside the very thing that will keep it from waking cleanly. For now, the bridges still hold. The cafés still forgive. The typewriter still flirts with the page as if nothing in the body has changed. Maybe nothing has. Maybe everything has. And the change is that it feels okay. So we breathe with Paris for a moment, longer in, longer out. Let memory kiss imagination on both cheeks. Then step back onto the boulevard, where the pharmacist is sweeping. The street lamp lists a little, and one small bottle glows under glass like a lantern someone forgot to put out. Take another slow breath, the kind that makes your ribs feel like they're opening little windows. Paris is quieter now. The rain has tidied the streets and left the stones shining like careful thoughts. Tonight we walk away from the warm counter and the courteous clerk and step behind the label, back to the room where the miracle was born. Not a palace, a lab. Benches nicked by years of beakers. Chalk ghosts on a slate blackboard. The clean medicinal smell of glass that's been boiled and dried, and the soft clink of pipettes tapping the edge of a flask like two coins greeting each other. Here, a chemist in a starched coat stands beneath a cone of lamplight. He is precise in the way that makes the world safer. Notebooks arranged, margins obeyed, hours kept. He is also human in the way that leads to turning points. A father in pain, a patient who winces, a city coughing through winter. Compassion married to method. That is how breakthroughs happen. On the page, the molecule looks like a small constellation. Rings and bonds, letters that don't pronounce but mean. Morphine is an old friend in medicine, reliable, powerful, but not gentle. The chemist wonders if a careful coat might tame it. Dress the wolf in something soft, a little alchemy of kindness. He acetylates, adds a pair of delicate hands to the backbone, and waits to see what they hold. The flask warms. The liquid turns from clear to a shy amber. He labels the vial with a tidy script, the way a baker pipes the name of a cake. Diacetyl morphine. It doesn't sing yet. Marketing will teach it to sing later. He is not thinking about cafes or painters or the late trains home. He is thinking about breath and pain and the way a cough takes the shape of a house and lives in it. He is thinking about the quiet that a body deserves. In come volunteers and patients and the early, earnest language of clinical notes. Less cough, easier breaths, good spirits, no nausea. The charts smile. The room hums the modest music of progress. Numbers improving, faces relieved. No one writes, careful. The tide returns differently with this moon, because no one knows it yet. Some miracles arrive gently, then walk faster than their guardians can keep up. A pharmacology chief with a gold watch reads the reports and hears opportunity knocking with a gloved hand. He believes he is doing the right thing. He also believes in sales. Science and commerce shake, agree to be friends. A printer inks a slogan that will age badly. A glass house stamps out 100,000 little sons. Salesmen rehearse sentences that will comfort general practitioners in towns with one church and two horses. The first crates go out with paper seals and good intentions. On a calendar in an executive office, pins move. Territories open like umbrellas. The Atlantic is not an obstacle. It is a promise. The map blooms in company colors. No one pins a corner for consequences. Consequences don't come by rail. A memo, real ordinary, written on paper that smells faintly of tobacco and ink, says what men in suits say when clouds are far away. A triumph of German engineering applied to human suffering. It is not wrong. It is not right enough. Now the molecule is in motion. Doctors welcome it like a visiting dignitary. Pharmacies dress a shelf for it the way a hostess sets a place at her best table. Patients who have been living inside a cough step outside for the first time in months. Pain eases. Sleep is not a battlefield. The relief feels like kindness because it is. But in the brain, a different story, told faster than language. That soft chemical coat lets the molecule slip through a guarded gate. It sits down where pleasure should sit only briefly, and it stays. The first time feels like the body finally remembering how to arrange itself. The second time feels like, of course. The third time teaches the body a new calendar. And yet, the ledger still smiles. Early follow-ups look good, because early is where trouble never lingers. The drug is a beautiful liar at the beginning. It persuades without raising its voice. It takes the edge off, then the corner, then the table, until the room is round and the windows don't open. In the lab, the chemist reads letters that begin with thanks. He sleeps better. He walks to work with a little lift. He never asked the molecule to make a promise it couldn't keep. He asked it to help, and it did. He will learn the rest later, like everyone else, when the world writes to him in a different tone. Meanwhile, the boardroom does what boardrooms do. It scales. The miracle becomes a product. The product becomes a line. The line becomes a strategy. The strategy becomes a year-end speech. Shareholders applaud the part of progress that fits in a dividend. No one invites biology to the podium, but a scientist in a hospital across the river starts keeping unofficial notes. Patient returned earlier than protocol. Requests dose increase, though symptoms resolved. Another writes, no longer seeks relief from cough, seeks relief from relief's absence. They use careful words because careful words are their tools. They do not yet have the blunt ones. Then, a few quiet reports from places where the suits don't go. A clinic with peeling paint sends a letter to the company stamped urgent in red. It is read, considered, set aside, and filed in the drawer called outliers. Outliers are how history asks nicely the first time. In the factory, a conveyor sings its little metal hymn. Glass bottles queue like faithful parishioners. Labels kiss their shoulders, corks seal their vows. A packer tucks straw around them like a mother. The crates leave in trucks that wheeze up hills and wink past houses where no one knows yet that someone inside will not sleep without a teaspoon soon. You could stand in the doorway of that lab, the first one, with the chalk dust and the lamp, and forgive everyone. The chemist with his neat notebooks and his tired eyes. The clinician with his belief in measurable mercy. The executive with his calendar and his conviction that helping people can be profitable without denaturing the help. You could even forgive the bottle, which has no agency, and yet becomes an accomplice the way a river becomes an accomplice to a flood simply by being a river. Progress is not a villain, but it is not a parent either. It doesn't come with the instincts to anticipate what a child will put in their mouth. It needs chaperones, ethics, humility, vigilance. In the 1920s, all three showed up late to work, and so the miracle keeps traveling, out of the lab, over the low stone wall of the hospital, across the polite counter, into the pocket where it warms against a heartbeat that will, by autumn, beat differently. It passes between friends like a recommendation, between lovers like an intimacy, between strangers like a password. The lab beaker cools. The suits lock the file cabinets. The chef in a left bank bistro, who has never heard of acetyl groups, sleeps badly and wakes to a persistent cough. He will walk to a pharmacy after lunch and ask for the bottle by name because someone at a neighboring table did last week. That's how the lab writes on the city without touching it. We close the door gently behind us. The chemist looks up, puzzled, as if he felt a draft. We leave him to his lamplight and his earnest heart. Between what was intended and what was unleashed, a city will now stretch its soul like a canvas and learn the hard lesson painted underneath every invention. What we make also makes us. The city of light has always had a hill where shadows gather. Montmartre, once the artist's refuge, where the scent of turpentine floated out of windows and cafés kept their doors open for starving poets, was beginning to hum with a different kind of commerce. It started innocently. A painter sells a sketch, a singer saves her tips, and both discover that money can stretch further when exchanged not for bread, but for a bottle passed by a friend. At first it was help. One student with better connections at the pharmacy buys 2 vials instead of 1, then sells the extra at cost to those who were turned away. No one calls it a trade. They call it kindness. But kindness scales. By 1925, Montmartre's crooked streets had more than artists carrying portfolios under their arms. There were quiet couriers with pockets stitched deeper than they looked. Shopkeepers who once sold brushes and pigments began keeping something else in drawers beneath the counter. The market for inspiration had discovered a more reliable fuel. Imagine walking into a café on Rue des Abbesses. Once the tables belonged to arguments about art movements, Cubism versus Impressionism, poetry versus prose. Now listen carefully. Voices drop to whispers about medicine, and the small glass vials on the table gleam brighter than the wine glasses. A doctor's name is mentioned the way one might mention a patron of the arts. Except this patron doesn't buy paintings. He writes prescriptions. A new profession is born in Montmartre, the provider. He is not quite a dealer, not quite a doctor. He is the person who knows someone. His notebook looks almost innocent, filled with initials and dates, tiny amounts written like grocery lists. But flip through enough pages and you realize it is an economy disguised as hospitality. The transformation is subtle but visible if you know where to look. Painters who once sold canvases now sell doses to buy more paint. Musicians tune their instruments slower, waiting for the hush to take hold before striking a note. Writers who once scribbled nervously on scraps of paper now let their pens drift into endless, unfinished loops of thought. The cafés remain full, but something about the rhythm has changed. Laughter is delayed, conversations stretch and unravel. Nights last longer, but mornings begin later. Montmartre is still alive, but it is breathing differently. There is profit, too, more than many artists ever dreamed of. Rent is paid on time, meals improve. Some who were unknown on the canvas become well known on the street. The irony is bitter. Success comes not from brush or pen, but from a substance carried in the lining of a coat. Behind the charm of Parisian bohemia, an invisible ledger grows. Glassblowers are busier than ever, producing vials without asking what they're for. Jewelers receive requests for small ornate cases, for medicine, at prices higher than gold chains. Even tailors adapt, stitching secret pockets into waistcoats and skirts. Everyone profits, even those who don't realize what they're selling. But under the surface, the danger begins to show. A singer forgets her lines mid-performance. A painter abandons half a canvas because the hush of the vial is more comforting than the struggle of finishing. Friendships change shape. Loyalty becomes measured in who can supply, not who can inspire. Montmartre's new market doesn't advertise, but it doesn't need to. It grows like ivy, quiet, persistent, wrapping itself around everything that touches it. And so the Hill, once famous for the windmills that ground grain and the cabarets that ground dreams into song, now grinds something else, lives into habits, habits into hunger, hunger into profit. Paris is still beautiful, but Montmartre has learned a new word, whispered like a secret password at cafe tables: supply. Paris has always known how to host a gathering, but in the mid-1920s, the salons of its high society glowed with a new ritual, one not printed in etiquette manuals, but whispered in doorways and enacted with the same elegance as pouring tea. These were not the smoky cafés of Montmartre. These were chandeliered rooms with velvet drapes, parquet floors polished to a mirrored shine, and portraits of ancestors watching from gilt frames. Guests arrived in silks and pearls, their coats taken by servants trained to be invisible. Laughter floated under ceilings painted with clouds. The tables glittered with porcelain and crystal. And among the silver trays of cakes and delicate sandwiches, there were other offerings, hidden in plain sight. A lady of the house, serene as a priestess, would gesture toward a small carved box or a cut glass vial. It looked like perfume, or perhaps a cordial. But her guests knew. This was the real refreshment, the secret that turned polite conversation into a slow, blissful fog. It began with discretion. A guest would excuse herself from the circle of conversation and drift toward a side table, where a doctor, trusted, discreet, well compensated, waited with instruments gleaming softly under the lamplight. Silver syringes polished as jewelry. Cotton pads scented faintly with alcohol. The doctor, in tailored suit and pince-nez glasses, never wore a white coat here. He blended with the company, as civilized as any guest. The lady sat, wrist extended, a faint smile on her lips, as if awaiting a bracelet to be clasped. The injection was swift, nearly painless, and wrapped in the same casual grace as adjusting a necklace. Within minutes, her face softened, shoulders eased, and her laughter rejoined the salon with a new, languid melody. Others followed, each with their own practiced grace. Some preferred small glass vials to sip, mixed with champagne in such tiny doses that no one could say for certain what sparkled more, the bubbles or the hush that followed. In these circles, appearances mattered more than reality. Addiction was not a word spoken in French salons. Instead, they spoke of nerves, stress, modern fatigue. These were ailments of sophistication, befitting women who hosted soirees and men who managed fortunes. Heroin in these rooms was not a drug, but a treatment, prescribed by physicians with impeccable credentials. Society believed itself protected by class and culture. What ravaged the back alleys could not possibly touch the marble foyers. And so the salons disguised dependency as refinement. To need relief was not weakness, it was proof of sensitivity, of intelligence too finely tuned for a noisy world. The effects seeped into every aspect of these glittering evenings. Conversations that began with sharp wit and spirited debate gradually softened into long, languid exchanges where words meandered and laughter arrived late. The salons became dreamlike, as if time itself had slowed beneath the chandeliers. A guest would begin a story, perhaps about a recent trip to the Riviera or a scandal whispered in the newspapers. And by the time she finished, half an hour later, no one remembered the beginning. But no one minded. The drift was the point. Poets recited verses that melted into silence. Musicians played slower, each note stretched like honey across crystal air. Even servants moved differently, gliding through the rooms with the same unhurried rhythm, their trays steadied by hands that seemed to float. But beneath the glitter, shadows grew. The very elegance that protected the ritual also concealed its cost. Pale skin was fashionable, so no one remarked on complexions drained of vitality. Thinness was chic, so no one questioned appetites disappearing. Forgetfulness was dismissed as the mark of artistic temperament. Fatigue was excused by the busy social calendar. Addiction hid beneath fashion, and fashion applauded its disguise. Some diaries, rare, private, written in hurried ink between soirees, hint at unease. The medicine steadies me, yet I feel less myself. The laughter sounds far, even when I speak. The children play at my feet, but their voices drift away as if I am listening through glass. Doctors, too, sometimes confessed in guarded lines. Lady X requests additional doses, though her cough is long resolved. The gatherings grow more frequent. I fear the boundary between remedy and indulgence is dissolving, but such notes stayed in locked drawers, not in published journals. No one wished to stain their reputation with warnings no one wanted to hear. Around these salons grew another economy, quieter but no less lucrative than Montmartre's. Jewelers crafted ornate cases for vials, lined with velvet, encrusted with gems. Pharmacists discreetly delivered crates disguised as champagne shipments. Even fashion adjusted. Designers added hidden pockets into gowns and purses, elegant enough to carry contraband under chandeliers. Everything looked graceful, but every gesture whispered dependence. The salons of serenity were not dens of crime or chaos. They were orchestras of control. Each note played softly, each ritual cloaked in civility. But addiction, no matter how finely dressed, carries the same tune. It is hunger in velvet gloves, longing behind painted lips, and silence behind laughter. And Paris, as always, applauded, until the applause grew too slow to be heard. The chandeliers are still lit, but the light no longer flatters. It pools in corners, sharpens the wrinkles around eyes, and makes pale skin appear waxen rather than fashionable. The salons of serenity, once havens of elegance, have begun to sour. At first, no one admits it. Guests still arrive in pearls and silk, their coats taken with the same discretion, the same smiles. The vials still gleam like jewels on polished trays. But conversations falter more often now. A hostess excuses herself twice in an hour. A guest falls silent mid-sentence, staring at the floor until someone gently steers him back to his chair. The ritual is unchanged, yet its effects are different. The serenity is harder to reach, shorter to hold, and rougher when it fades. Servants, once invisible, now unavoidable witnesses, carry the truth first. They notice the empty vials piling faster. They notice when a lady weeps alone in her room after the guests have gone. They notice when a child lingers by a door, listening, and grows quiet afterward. In the salons themselves, whispers sharpen. One baroness leans close to another. She takes too much. You can see it in her eyes, the reply, "Better her than me." Mine is prescribed. The word prescribed becomes a shield, thinner each week, but clung to desperately. The physicians, polished and polite, begin to feel their hands tremble. They know the dosages have climbed far beyond necessity. They know the coughs have healed, the fevers long gone. And yet their wealthy patients, their influential patrons, insist. Some relent out of fear of losing income, fear of losing status, fear of confrontation. Others convince themselves, a lady must not suffer nerves, a gentleman must not lose composure. They write another prescription, they prepare another syringe. They tell themselves it is care. But a few begin to resist, they cut supplies, reduce dosages, stall with excuses. And in doing so, they awaken something frightening. The serene hostess grows irritable. The charming guest becomes demanding, then furious. Friendships strain. Trust fractures. Dependence erodes the theater of grace. Guests who once lingered at parties now vanish early, clutching their purses. Invitations once sought after now go unanswered. The salons grow emptier, their conversations flatter. Laughter is no longer delayed because of bliss, but because no one remembers the joke. Music slows not for atmosphere, but because the pianist's hands tremble. The salons, once dreamlike, now feel haunted by their own decline. In private, the collapse is sharper. Marriages fray as partners retreat into separate fogs. Parents, distracted and distant, fail to notice their children's questions or their tears. Wealth cushions many things, but not absence, not silence. Some diaries grow darker. I cannot sleep without it. I cannot wake without it. The world is unbearable in its absence, unbearable in its presence. I fear I am hollowing these confessions rarely leave the page. But history finds them, folded between letters and receipts, proof that even the grandest houses were not immune to emptiness. Authorities, long indifferent, start to notice. Not in the salons first, but in hospitals and clinics where patients arrive pale, restless, in agony. Doctors whisper of dependency. Newspapers, timidly at first, hint at a crisis of nerves among the fashionable. By 1927, the French government faces what society had tried to hide, an epidemic cloaked in velvet. The ban arrives suddenly, announced in stern official language. Heroin, once legal, once celebrated, is now forbidden. And in that moment, the salons collapse completely. For those who depended quietly, secretly, the ban is devastating. Doctors refuse to prescribe. Pharmacies lock their cabinets. Deliveries halt. The ornate cases, once filled with sparkling vials, now lie empty in drawers. Desperation replaces civility. Friends turn on each other, searching for the last sources. Servants, once discreet, are sent on dangerous errands. Some succeed, many fail. And those who fail face a silence more terrifying than any scandal, the silence of withdrawal, of nights stretched endless, of a body begging without words. Montmartre, already fluent in the language of supply, steps in. But their vials are different now, unregulated, adulterated, uncertain. The fog of serenity is gone, replaced by chaos. What was once polished ritual becomes frantic survival. Paris learns too late what it had pretended not to see: that elegance cannot protect against hunger, that silk cannot disguise need, and that dependence makes no distinction between alley and salon. The chandeliers are still lit, but no one looks up anymore. The year was 1927, and Paris awoke to new laws. The decree was simple, almost clinical. Heroin was banned. What had been prescribed freely, sold openly, and sipped delicately from crystal vials was now declared illicit, dangerous, forbidden. The morning newspapers printed it with sober ink, tucked between stories of politics and fashion. But in salons and apartments across the city, the effect was electric. The comfortable haze that had lulled the city's wealthy, the creative, the anxious, had suddenly been outlawed. The chandeliers still hung, but they no longer glowed with confidence. In houses that once hosted endless soirees, curtains remained drawn. Guests whispered excuses not to attend. Those who arrived found empty trays, anxious hosts, and conversations that broke off into uneasy pauses. Some clutched the last of their vials like relics, stretching a dose across days, bargaining with themselves. Others begged their physicians for one more prescription, one more exception. But doctors, once indulgent, had grown cautious. To defy the law was to risk reputation, license, and prison. The syringe was put away, the bottle locked. Dependence, once disguised as elegance, had nowhere to hide. While the salons hushed, Montmartre hummed. The hill that had always thrived on shadows now stirred with opportunity. The cafés and cabarets, still alive with jazz and cigarette smoke, now whispered of a different trade. Men with hats pulled low waited at street corners. Women with painted lips carried parcels in their handbags. A cough could be treated here still, though the remedy came not from a doctor's hand, but from a stranger's pocket. But what flowed now was different. No longer measured doses, no longer polished vials. Instead, powders of uncertain origin, mixtures cut and stretched to double their profit. The serenity of the salons was gone. In its place came a harsher fog, unpredictable, dangerous. For those accustomed to refinement, the descent was brutal. A baroness once serenely hosting soirees now sent her driver down alleys, pressing coins into hands that shook with laughter. Artists who once toasted inspiration in Montmartre cafés now stumbled through the same doors, not for absinthe or wine, but for a scrap of powder wrapped in paper. The language shifted too. What was once called a remedy or medicine was now whispered as la marchandise, the merchandise. Dependence lost its euphemisms. It was need, naked and raw. Trust dissolved. Where once a polished physician with spectacles had offered a measured syringe, now a boy no older than 20 handed out powders in matchboxes. Where once a pharmacist recorded purchases in neat ledgers, now a smuggler scrawled debts in code on scraps of paper. And the new masters did not care for health nor for civility. They cared only for payment. Silk gowns and pearls, once symbols of status, now meant nothing in a Montmartre cellar. Hunger leveled all distinctions. Paris itself seemed altered. The boulevards still shone, the cafés still buzzed, but beneath the glow lay a nervous current. Police raided small shops, confiscating bottles and powders. Journalists wrote of the hidden plague. Yet every crackdown only pushed the trade deeper, into basements, into backrooms, into whispers carried across bridges at night. Dependence had not vanished with the law. it had merely changed its face. What was once a ritual of elegance became a struggle in the dark, a chase through shadows, a bargain with strangers. And Paris, city of lights, learned that shadows could stretch even beneath its brightest lamps. Paris itself seemed altered. The boulevards still shone, the cafés still buzzed, but beneath the glow lay a nervous current. Police raided small shops, confiscating bottles and powders. Journalists wrote of the hidden plague. Yet every crackdown only pushed the trade deeper into basements, into backrooms, into whispers carried across bridges at night. Dependence had not vanished with the law, it had merely changed its face. What was once a ritual of elegance became a struggle in the dark, a chase through shadows, a bargain with strangers. And Paris, city of lights, learned that shadows could stretch even beneath its brightest lamps. Carriages still rolled down the Champs-Élysées, and pearls still glittered at the opera. But behind closed doors, desperation gnawed at nobility. Women who once sipped from jeweled vials now instructed their maids to visit Montmartre, to ask questions in smoky bars. A count, unable to bear the humiliation of begging a doctor, pulled his collar high and walked himself into a cellar, bargaining with a stranger who smelled of gin. The aristocracy learned how to disguise itself, not from paparazzi, not from gossip, but from the shame of need. Yet shame was a weak disguise. Dealers knew. They saw the tremor in the hands, the hollowness in the eyes. They raised prices accordingly. Addiction had no respect for family crests. The artists of Paris, who had embraced heroin as muse and companion, were among the first to fall hardest. In Montmartre, studios once alive with color and daring ideas, canvases grew pale. Paint dried on palettes, while their creators drifted into stupor or stumbled into alleys seeking another packet. Poets, once sharp-tongued, forgot their stanzas. Musicians slowed their rhythms until the music broke. What heroin had once promised, a widening of perception, a deepening of emotion, was gone. Only silence remained, punctuated by the scratch of a match in the dark. Some turned to crime to fund the fog, a stolen watch here, a pawned painting there. For the first time, Montmartre's bohemians blurred with its criminals, bound by the same hunger. In the grand houses, servants who once fetched bottles from trusted pharmacists now walked dangerous streets at night. They carried purses of gold, but returned with paper packets whose contents no one could guarantee. Some were robbed, some were beaten. A few, curious, tried the merchandise themselves, and so the fog spread downward from chandelier to cellar, from mistress to maid. The boundaries between classes, so carefully drawn in daylight, blurred in the night economy. Hunger erased etiquette. A lady in silk and a dock worker in rags could find themselves waiting at the same doorway, exchanging no words, but knowing the same need. With prohibition, a new order emerged. Small-time peddlers gave way to larger networks, men with cars, warehouses, and connections beyond France. The merchandise came in crates marked as wine, as olives, as perfumes. It arrived hidden in suitcases from Marseille, smuggled through ports in the dead of night. Where once the pharmacy ledger had tracked doses, now coded notebooks recorded debts and threats. Where once a doctor's polite reminder had guided behavior, now knives and fists enforced payment. Dependence had a new master, and this one did not wear spectacles or carry syringes polished like jewelry. This one smelled of leather and smoke, spoke in mutters, and counted francs with stained fingers. The surface of Paris remained dazzling, The Eiffel Tower glittered, jazz bands played, and tourists strolled the boulevards. But beneath, the city carried an unease. Parents whispered fears for their children. Newspapers began to print darker headlines. Police raided bars, but the trade slipped away, always finding another alley, another cellar. The elegance was gone. The civility was gone. What remained was hunger, naked, persistent, merciless. The law had fallen like a hammer, but the echoes were stranger than anyone foresaw. Paris was split in two. By day it still glittered, laughter in cafés, perfume in the air, the metallic glint of the Eiffel Tower in sunlight. But by night the city was restless, nervous, haunted. The ban had not ended heroin, it had only driven it into darker corners. Police wagons rattled through narrow streets, their wheels echoing off stone walls. Uniforms stormed into back rooms and cafés, overturning tables, scattering patrons. Packets of powder slipped into gutters, into pockets, into mouths, before the gendarmes could seize them. Some arrests made headlines. A cabaret singer, once famous for her silk gowns and scandalous songs, dragged through the street in tears. A minor aristocrat, pale and trembling, exposed in a police report. But for every raid, 10 new doors opened. The trade was quicksilver. It seeped, slipped, and never stilled. Hospitals filled with cases they did not know how to treat. Young men collapsed in alleys, lungs failing. Women found in apartments, their crystal vials empty, their lips blue. Priests muttered prayers over too many coffins, while families invented gentler explanations. A weak heart, a sudden fever. Society buried its dead with discretion, but the numbers grew. Death, once distant in velvet salons, now knocked at the door. Above ground, Paris carried on. Lovers kissed on bridges, painters sketched along the Seine, jazz bands roared in Montmartre clubs. Tourists arrived with cameras, eager for romance and light. But beneath, another Paris thrived. The Paris of coded whispers, of trembling hands exchanging francs for powder. The Paris where hunger bent the backs of nobles and beggars alike. It was a city of two faces, the radiant mask of modernity and the shadowed hollow beneath. Those who once sat beneath chandeliers now lived with ghosts. They haunted their own rooms, staring at the empty trays that had once held comfort. Mirrors reflected pale faces, eyes searching for something already gone. Letters from the time speak of despair wrapped in politeness. The house is quiet. I cannot eat. My hands tremble as I write. Paris feels colder than before. Even the language changed. The word serenity vanished from conversation. In its place came need. The ban had not saved the city. It had exposed it. Heroin had moved from pharmacy shelves to cellar shadows, and in doing so, it had stripped away illusions. Doctors were no longer guides, but bystanders. Police were no longer protectors, but pursuers. Families no longer hosts, but mourners. Paris learned that once hunger takes hold, law cannot cure it. The city of light had become quietly a city of shadows. By 1928, the Paris crisis was no longer just Parisian. The fog that had begun in Montmartre, that drifted into salons and then seeped into alleys, had become too visible for the world to ignore. Diplomats, alarmed doctors, and moral reformers carried stories of heroin addiction from France to Geneva. And in Geneva, in the halls of the League of Nations, the issue took on an international voice. Imagine the room, heavy wood tables, stacks of papers. The flags of nations lined in rows, each representing a promise of cooperation after the First World War. And at the center of debate, heroin. delegates spoke in careful tones, but beneath the courtesy lay urgency. Reports had arrived from Paris, Berlin, New York, Shanghai. Hospitals filled with cases of dependence, pharmacies abusing their trust, families collapsing in silence. It was no longer a French matter. It was global. The word epidemic appeared in documents. Doctors described symptoms not as weakness of will, but as a disease that spread in patterns eerily similar to contagion. Some warned of crime networks stepping into the gap left by prohibition. Others feared entire generations could be lost. The air in Geneva was thick with compromise and fear. The result was the 1928 International Opium Convention. Heroin, once hailed as a miracle of German chemistry, once sold by French and American pharmacies as cure and comfort, was now written into treaties as a global danger. Production would be limited only to scientific and medical research. Trade would be controlled under international supervision. Use for ordinary treatment of pain, cough, or anxiety would end. It was the first time nations, fractured by so much else, united to outlaw a single drug across the world. But treaties cannot erase habits, nor can signatures on parchment dismantle networks already taking root. As governments signed treaties in Geneva, ships arrived in Marseille. Crates labeled olive oil, textiles, or wine carried other goods hidden deep inside. The Mediterranean became an artery, carrying the new forbidden merchandise not only into Paris, but across Europe and beyond. Marseille would in time become infamous as the beating heart of smuggling. Families built fortunes, crime syndicates organized supply chains, and the city's docks grew into a new marketplace, more powerful than Montmartre's backrooms. The world had declared heroin illegal. Marseille made it profitable. Governments congratulated themselves in Geneva, but reality was harsher. In Paris, the law had already shown its limits. Raids and arrests could not kill demand. Internationally, the challenge was greater. Borders were porous, corruption was common, and demand only grew as prohibition made supply rarer, riskier, and therefore more lucrative. For the first time, heroin belonged not to doctors or patients, but to criminals and smugglers. When the stock market fell in October 1929, the tremors raced across oceans and continents. What began in New York soon struck Paris, London, Berlin. Factories slowed, banks wavered, unemployment soared. The cafe chatter that once sparkled with optimism dimmed into nervous whispers about savings lost, jobs gone, bread harder to afford. For the heroin dependent, the crash was more than economic. It was catastrophic. Addiction is a hunger that does not wait for paychecks. When money vanished, so did the fragile balance that allowed many to maintain appearances. Aristocrats sold jewelry in secret. Artists pawned their instruments. Servants and laborers went unpaid and turned desperate. What had been an expensive indulgence became an impossible demand. And when desperation meets scarcity, danger multiplies. Imagine the city again, this time not in the glow of cabarets, but in the gray drizzle of an economic winter. Bread lines stretched along boulevards. Families rationed scraps of meat. Men stood idle at factory gates that would never open again. Among them were those whose bodies shook without heroin. Without supply, they convulsed, sweated, trembled. Some collapsed. Others begged on corners where, just years before, they had dined on silver. Dealers, recognizing the desperation, adapted quickly. They cut their products further. Where once powder had been pure, it was now mixed with flour, sugar, chalk, even poisons. The risks rose as the quality fell. Overdoses spiked. What little stability remained in the addict's world dissolved into chaos. The Depression stripped away illusions faster than Prohibition ever had. Before, salons and artists' lofts could still hide the truth beneath glamour. But hunger is hard to disguise. Letters from the time tell of families collapsing. A mother pawning her wedding ring for medicine she pretended was for her nerves. A musician selling his violin and never being seen on stage again. A maid dismissed without pay, returning at night to her employer's home not for work, but to beg for powder. The city that once danced to jazz now staggered in silence. The Depression did not stop at Paris. Reports came from Berlin, where addicts collapsed on trams. From London, where Scotland Yard raided dens hidden behind tailor shops. From New York, where speakeasies now hosted not only bootleg gin, but packets of heroin smuggled in through the same criminal pipelines. The League of Nations had banned heroin, but the Depression made enforcement impossible. Customs officers were unpaid, police departments underfunded, governments overwhelmed. In that weakness, the networks grew stronger. Perhaps most devastating was the collapse of the illusion that heroin belonged to elegance. No longer confined to Parisian salons or artistic cafés, it now appeared in the poorest neighborhoods, among the unemployed, the homeless, the desperate. Dependency, once hidden behind velvet curtains, now stood openly in bread lines, shaking with cold and withdrawal. It was no longer a secret shame of the elite. It was a public wound of society. As the Depression deepened, something else spread. Organization. What had begun as scattered dealers in Montmartre cafés now hardened into networks, disciplined and ruthless. At the center was Marseille. Its ports, already alive with legitimate trade, became arteries for the illicit. Crates unloaded in the dead of night, ships rerouted, papers forged. Families who had once traded in olive oil or wine discovered that heroin brought quicker fortune. Soon, Marseille was not just feeding Paris, but Berlin, London, New York. What Paris had birthed in salons and cafés, Marseille transformed into business. The City of Lights had become only one node in a web that circled the globe. The faces of supply changed. Gone were the white-coated pharmacists and polite doctors with reassuring tones. In their place came men in dark coats, men with pistols tucked into belts, men who enforced debts with knives. They spoke not of cures, but of prices. Their currency was fear as much as francs. Those who failed to pay found doors broken, reputations ruined, sometimes bodies left in alleys. Dependence no longer rested in medical language. It lived under criminal law. What began in back rooms soon expanded into syndicates with international reach. Smugglers linked Marseille to North Africa, to the Middle East, to Asia. Laboratories sprouted in secret, refining morphine into heroin, preparing shipments that crossed borders with alarming efficiency. Police forces were underfunded, governments distracted by economic collapse, and corruption opened gates that laws had closed. By the early 1930s, organized crime was not a rumor. It was empire. From Paris to Shanghai, from Berlin to New York, heroin traveled in invisible caravans. In port cities, in warehouses, in hidden compartments of ships, the forbidden powder moved. Every seizure made headlines, yet every success only revealed how much slipped through unseen. Treaties signed in Geneva became paper against the tide. Paris no longer stood alone. What had begun as a city secret was now a world shadow. Addicts in Montmartre were bound, unseen, to attics in Harlem, in Hamburg, in Cairo. The hunger was the same, the supply the same, the despair the same. Paris had been the spark, Marseille the fire, the world the fuel. By the early 1930s, the world's governments had realized the scope of what heroin had become. What had once been a trusted medicine was now the heartbeat of a global black market, carried in crates and hidden in pockets across continents. The response was sharp and often theatrical. In Paris, police raided Montmartre cafés with dogs and torches. In Berlin, squads stormed basements beneath dance halls. In New York, agents kicked down doors of tenements where both gin and heroin flowed together. Officials wanted headlines, victories to show the public that order was returning. Every raid was photographed, every seizure reported. Yet beneath the spectacle, the current remained unchanged. Arrests filled prisons, but emptied neither veins nor alleys. Governments also turned to language. Posters warned of the poison in the veins of nations. Pamphlets called addicts slaves and heroin the destroyer of youth. Lectures were held in schools, sermons given in churches. The tone was moralistic, condemning rather than understanding. Addiction was painted as weakness, as sin, as failure. The complexity of dependence, the desperation of withdrawal, the human faces behind the habit were erased. Shame became policy. Penalties hardened. In some countries, possession meant years in prison. Dealers faced death sentences in parts of Asia. Judges spoke of deterrence, of cleansing society through fear. But fear cannot cure hunger, and punishment does not erase need. Addicts, stripped of sympathy, withdrew further into shadows. Dealers, driven by profit, became more ruthless. The gap between law and life widened into a canyon. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies continued to produce heroin in small, tightly controlled batches for scientific purposes. Governments themselves licensed limited production, fearing shortages for research. Thus, even as newspapers declared total prohibition, the machinery of heroin's creation still turned, quietly feeding both laboratories and smugglers. A paradox born of policy, a banned substance that never truly disappeared. The 1928 convention, the police raids, the propaganda posters, they marked only the beginning. The framework of global prohibition, built then, still echoes today. Nations continued to legislate, to punish, to fight. Yet heroin remained, shifting routes, adapting suppliers, flowing where demand drew it. Paris was no longer the epicenter, but the lessons it left behind were clear. That prohibition without compassion creates crime. That shame without understanding deepens suffering. That addiction, treated as a moral stain, becomes a wound that societies struggle to heal. By the end of the 1930s, the world had changed again. Depression had scarred economies. New wars brewed on horizons, and heroin, outlawed yet unextinguished, lived on in hidden veins and whispered deals. Paris's chapter was only the beginning of a longer story, one that would stretch through decades, through wars, through policies that repeated mistakes more often than they learned from them. Not every tragedy of heroin was found in salons or in prisons. Many of them unfolded behind closed doors in the quiet rooms where children grew up watching their parents change. A child does not always know the name of a drug. They do not recognize the bitter powder, the small glass vials, the rituals carried out in secrecy. But they recognize the change. They feel it, the warmth of a parent's voice one hour and the sudden coldness the next. the laughter that turns into silence, the embrace that slackens into distance. In Paris, in the years after the ban, countless children lived inside homes where dependence dictated rhythm. Meals were missed, tempers flared, stories half told were abandoned as fatigue or craving set in. To be a child in such a household was to grow in constant alertness, learning to read subtle cues, the tension in a jaw, the way footsteps sounded on the stairs, the silence that meant trouble. For these children, home was less a refuge and more a shifting landscape of moods. Addiction is not only physical, it is relational. It stretches beyond the body of the one who uses, pulling others into its orbit. Children often became interpreters of the fog. They learned early when to stay silent, when to soothe, when to vanish into another room. Their games were quieter, their laughter restrained, for fear of waking shadows in their parents' moods. One diary fragment, written years later by the daughter of a Parisian actress, recalls, "We never knew which mother would come home, the one who sang or the one who stared at the wall. I learned to listen at the door before entering. If she was humming, I felt safe. If she was quiet, I hid." This inheritance of fear shaped not just childhoods, but lives. Even as adults, many carried the reflexes of silence and vigilance, scars of a childhood lived under shifting skies. The cruelest wound, perhaps, was not the violence, but the absence. Addicted parents often drifted between highs and lows, leaving gaps that children filled with longing. Birthdays passed unnoticed, promises dissolved. The child who once believed in endless affection came to expect disappointment. Letters from the time, preserved in archives, speak of children writing to parents who were physically present but emotionally absent. One boy wrote, "Papa, you sit in the chair but do not look at me. I wait for you to tell me a story, but you are always too tired." It was not abandonment in the physical sense, but an emotional vanishing. For a child, perhaps the deeper pain. Not every child lost themselves in the fog. Some carried a strange kind of strength, born from necessity. Living in uncertainty taught them to adapt, to notice details, to anticipate shifts in mood with uncanny precision. What for one child was trauma, for another became a sharpened sense of survival. A boy from Montmartre, later interviewed as an old man, remembered, "I was always watching. I could tell if my father was unwell by the way he closed the door. I could tell if he had money or not by the sound of his shoes. I learned how to read a room before I even knew how to read a book." This ability, though born of hardship, sometimes became a tool. Some of these children grew into doctors, writers, activists, people who dedicated their lives to naming and healing what their families never could. Others simply endured, carrying the scars in silence, but refusing to let the fog swallow them whole. A few became storytellers, diaries, memoirs, novels, fragments of testimony that survived. What they wrote was not always explicit, often veiled in metaphor, but the echoes were clear. Homes of silence, parents fading, love stretched thin by hunger that could not be fed. Their writings serve as reminders that behind every statistic, every law, every raid, there were rooms with children waiting, hoping, trying to understand. History often speaks of addicts and policies, but rarely of the little ones who watched from corners of kitchens or behind cracked doors. Through their words, the silence gains voice. Addiction rarely ends with one body. Its marks ripple through generations. Children who grew up in its shadow often carried its weight into their own families. Some repeated the patterns, turning to alcohol, to drugs, to escapes of their own. Others became fiercely protective, determined to never let their children feel what they once felt. Either way, the past pressed forward, shaping futures unseen. Researchers decades later would call this intergenerational trauma. But for those who lived it, there was no name, only the feeling of something heavy carried into adulthood, the sense of being shaped by a fog that was never theirs to choose. Yet amid the sorrow, there is resilience. Many children of the fog built ordinary lives, found love, raised families, pursued work, and carved out joy. Their strength was quiet, uncelebrated, often invisible. They endured because endurance was the first lesson they ever learned. An old woman, once the daughter of a dependent seamstress, put it simply, "I never hated my mother. I knew she was lost, but I also knew she loved me, even when she couldn't show it. That was enough to keep me alive." When heroin seeped into Parisian homes, it did not isolate itself in a single person. It spread outward, drawing entire families into its circle. The addicted parent became the most visible figure, but spouses carried the burden of silence, siblings felt the fracture, and children bore the invisible inheritance. Family meals grew tense, conversations clipped, love became entangled with worry, and trust was worn thin. In many homes, it was the children who noticed first when something was wrong, the quiet mood, the empty purse, the skipped meal. But when they asked questions, answers rarely came. Silence, excuses, or anger were their inheritance. For some families, the bonds frayed until they snapped. Divorces, separations, relatives taking in the children while parents drifted deeper into dependence. For others, the family remained intact but strained, carrying the constant weight of an unspoken reality. Children carried their home lives into the world outside. At school, teachers noticed tired eyes, unwashed clothes, or distracted stares. Some children were teased by peers, labeled with cruel nicknames. Orphans with parents, one diary recalls. Yet others hid the truth well. They became quiet, diligent, determined to please teachers, desperate for approval in a world where affection at home was uncertain. The schoolyard became both a refuge and a reminder, a place to feel normal for a few hours, but also a stage where the contrast between themselves and others was painfully clear. Neighborhoods, too, bore the marks. In Montmartre, in Saint-Denis, in the arrondissements where the fog lingered thickest, whispers circulated. Everyone knew which households were touched. Some neighbors offered compassion, sharing bread or keeping an eye on children when parents disappeared. Others turned away, fearing contamination, not of disease, but of shame. Churches, charities, and local associations sometimes stepped in. A few priests became quiet caretakers for children left unattended. Some women's groups organized aid, clothing drives, free meals. But the stigma was strong. To admit the problem was to risk being marked, and many families chose secrecy over help. By the 1930s, Paris was not only a city of light, but also a city of shadows. Entire streets where addiction shaped the rhythm of daily life. Children grew up surrounded by contradictions, the beauty of the boulevards and the despair of their own kitchens, the laughter of street performers and the silence of their parents. These contradictions became the texture of their memories, a patchwork of wonder and sorrow. For them, Paris was not just a city of romance and art, It was also the city where they learned that love can be present and absent at once, that a parent can be both near and unreachable. And yet from these children seeds of change sometimes grew. Some became doctors who pushed for addiction to be treated as illness, not sin. Others became writers who gave voice to what had been unspeakable. A few entered politics determined to shape laws with compassion rather than condemnation. Their lives were not defined only by the fog, but by the way they learned to walk through it. What they carried, they transformed. Looking back, it is easy to focus on the salons, the cafés, the treaties, the syndicates. But history is also written in kitchens, in bedrooms, in schoolyards, in the quiet resilience of children who endured. They were the forgotten witnesses of an epidemic. They did not sign treaties. They did not trade in markets. They did not write prescriptions. But they carried the marks of all of it, etched into their growing years. And when they grew older, they became the ones who remembered, who told the stories, who reminded the world that heroin was not just a matter of politics or crime, but of childhoods altered, of innocence reshaped, of lives forever touched. Now that our journey has reached its final moments, let us step back, slowly, as if walking at night through the quiet streets of Paris, when the lamps are low and the world is hushed. We began with a bottle on a pharmacy shelf, something small, ordinary, almost invisible. It was sold with promises of relief, a miracle in liquid form. No one could have guessed how such an object would carry an entire city, and later the world, into shadows. We followed the chemist in his lab coat, careful and proud, convinced that science had found a gentler remedy for suffering. His intentions were honest, his hands steady, but history would turn his creation into something he could not imagine. From there, we walked into Montmartre, where cafés echoed with laughter, paintbrushes scraped against canvas, and music floated through smoke-filled rooms. Yet beneath the charm, another market stirred, one of powders and whispers, of need disguised as pleasure. We stepped through the doors of salons where chandeliers glittered and polite conversation veiled quiet rituals of dependence. We saw elegance entwined with despair, beauty masking fragility, wealth unable to shield hearts and homes from the grip of addiction. And then, the collapse, the government's ban, the silence that fell, the shadows that grew darker as doctors were replaced by dealers, as trust gave way to fear. Paris became two cities at once, one glowing with lights and art, the other whispering in alleys, restless, hungry, searching. The story widened, spilling beyond France into treaties signed in Geneva, into smugglers' routes winding through Marseille, into the currents of the global depression. Addiction was no longer a local affliction, but a thread binding continents. And finally we entered the homes of children, the quietest victims. We listened to the silence of kitchens, the careful footsteps in hallways, the promises broken, and the resilience born in small hearts. We saw how the fog carried not only into veins, but into generations, shaping lives long after the powders were gone. Each part of the journey has been its own lantern, casting light on different corners of a single truth. History is not only written in events and laws, but in breaths, in voices, in the quiet endurance of ordinary lives. History often teaches us in loud voices, through wars, revolutions, treaties signed with fanfare. But this story speaks in a quieter tone. It reminds us that fragility is as much a part of humanity as strength, A bottle in a pharmacy could look harmless, a prescription could feel reassuring, a glittering salon could appear safe. Yet fragility lingered within them all. It was not the weak who stumbled, but the ordinary, mothers, fathers, artists, workers, the wealthy and the poor alike. Addiction, in its slow and invisible spread, revealed something about the human condition, that we are vulnerable even when we believe ourselves secure. The lesson is not one of shame, but of recognition. To be human is to be open to both light and shadow. Another truth becomes clear. Societies respond to crises not only with compassion, but also with fear. When heroin's hold grew undeniable, governments reacted with bans, raids, punishments. These responses may have felt decisive, but they also deepened the wounds. What was once a matter of doctors and patients became one of dealers and prisoners. History shows us the cost of forgetting compassion. Laws can silence but cannot heal. Shame can hide but cannot cure. Punishment can frighten but cannot comfort. The lesson lingers. When we face shadows, we must choose carefully between fear and care. Yet endurance runs through every chapter of this story. The endurance of artists who still painted even as their hands trembled. The endurance of families who held together through silence and strain. The endurance of children who learned to survive by watching, listening, and adapting. Endurance is quiet. It is not the triumph of banners or the roar of armies. It is the small breath taken in the midst of despair. It is the act of carrying on when nothing seems certain. In Paris, endurance took many forms. Sometimes it was tragic, sometimes miraculous, sometimes invisible. But it was always there, beating like a faint heart beneath the fog. The story has carried us through shadows of history, through salons, streets, treaties, and homes. But now, in this final stretch, the gaze turns gently outward, toward you, the listener. History is never only about the past. It is always about the present, about the echoes we carry, about the questions we ask ourselves when the world grows quiet. As you listen now, perhaps in bed, with the night gathered around you, consider the way stories drift across time. A Parisian mother in 1925, a chemist in a white coat, a child walking carefully through a hushed house. They may seem far away, but in their fears and hopes, they are closer than you think. There is a thread that runs between past and present. It is not made of dates or laws, but of feelings. The weariness of a long day, the hope for comfort, the longing for peace. The people you've heard about tonight, the artists, the aristocrats, the children, they were human, with hearts that beat like yours. Their worries, though dressed in different clothing, echo the same rhythm. When we reflect on them, we do not only learn about heroin or prohibition or Paris. We learn about ourselves, how fragile we are, how enduring, how we always seek meaning even in fog. So pause for a moment. Imagine your own life in the flow of history. The noise of your day, the worries that pressed on you, the fleeting joys, they too are threads in a tapestry that will outlast the moment. As you breathe now, you carry the same quiet resilience that carried countless lives before you. The same endurance that lit candles in the dark streets of Paris also glows, faint but steady, within you. You need not force meaning onto everything. Sometimes it is enough to rest, to acknowledge that you are part of a much longer story, one that stretches back into shadows and forward into light. Let history be not only a lesson, but a companion. Let the stories soften the edges of your own worries. Let the past remind you that endurance does not require perfection, only persistence. As you drift now, the story need not end. It folds into your breathing, into your thoughts, into your dreams. And in that space between waking and sleep, perhaps you will carry with you not only knowledge of the past, but also a gentler view of your own present. The story has wandered far. We have walked through the crowded cafés of Montmartre, through the hushed salons of the aristocracy, through government halls and shadowed alleys. We have followed the long arc of discovery, denial, collapse, and consequence. And now, at last, the story itself is quieting. It is late. Paris, that restless, shining city, begins to close its eyes. Imagine a street in the 1930s. The lamps flicker with a thin orange glow, then gutter and fade as the night deepens. A shopkeeper locks his wooden door and slides the iron bolt into place. The bakery that once filled the air with warmth and bread now lies dark, the ovens cold, the counters bare. The voices that rose with wine and laughter in the evening have dwindled. The last words of the last customers fade into silence. The cafe chairs are stacked, the tables wiped down, and a boy sweeps dust from the floor with slow, lazy strokes. A cart rattles by, carrying nothing but the smell of hay and the quiet clop of horse hooves. The driver hums a low, tuneless note just to keep himself company. And then even that fades, leaving only the hush of empty streets. The homes of Paris close one by one. Shutters creak shut, curtains are drawn. The city folds itself inward. Inside, a woman bends over a candle flame, whispering a prayer. She snuffs the light, and darkness settles around her like a blanket. Children nestle into their narrow beds, pulling covers up to their chins. The night air is cool. Somewhere, a dog sighs and curls against the door. The great boulevards, once so alive with the clamor of cars and laughter, fall still. The air carries only the faint rustle of leaves in trees and the long, steady breath of the river. The Seine moves quietly through the city. It does not hurry. It has carried centuries of voices, centuries of light and sorrow. It has reflected the glow of revolutions and the shimmer of festivals. Tonight it reflects only the pale light of the moon. It is as though the river itself exhales. A long, slow breath. The ripples carry outward, glimmering softly, then vanish into the dark. The bridges stand watch, their stones cool and silent. Where once lovers met or couriers hurried with folded letters, now there is only stillness. The city is not dead. It is resting. It is listening to itself, as you too listen now, waiting not for the next noise, but for the calm that follows. A single figure walks along the cobblestones. His steps echo, then soften, then fade as he turns down another street. The echo lingers and then is gone. And when even footsteps have vanished, Paris seems to breathe. The city itself, like a great living body, has inhaled the day and now exhales into night. The noise of memory quiets. The weight of time grows light. And in this calm we find a mirror. History itself falls asleep. Now, as Paris settles into its silence, the story folds gently inward. No more footsteps, no more noise, only breath. Imagine the rhythm. Inhale, exhale. The city itself seems to breathe. The streets expand with memory, then contract with forgetfulness. The river lifts, then lowers. Even the air seems to pause before moving again. So too with you, lying here now. You breathe in, you breathe out. Slowly, gently. With each breath, the weight of the day loosens. With each breath, the stories of centuries soften into the present moment. Inhale, memory. The images of the past, salons glittering, chemists working, children waiting at doors. Exhale, release. The stories flow out like smoke through the cracks of time, leaving calm behind. Inhale, the strength of those who endured. Exhale, the worry you no longer need to hold. Inhale, the silence of the night. Exhale, the heaviness of the day. You're not forcing anything. You are simply joining a rhythm older than history, older than words. Every generation has breathed this way. The mothers in Montmartre who closed their shutters, the fathers who trudged back from work, the children who listened in silence, all of them breathed just as you breathe now. History is not only written in books, it is carried in lungs, in quiet breaths through countless nights. What you do now, lying in the dark, exhaling into calm, is part of the same unbroken chain, and as you feel that rhythm, you may notice that your body begins to rest. Muscles slacken, shoulders sink, thoughts grow softer, like lanterns dimming at the close of a street. Breathing is a tide. It rises, it falls. It carries you further out into the sea of sleep, then back again to the shore of waking, until finally the tide takes you out into dream. There is nothing you need to do. Only trust the tide. Only allow your breath to carry you. If thoughts come, let them float like driftwood. They do not need to be gathered. They will pass on their own. And as they drift, you remain here, calm, quiet, breathing with history. Breathing is a tide. It rises, it falls. It carries you further out into the sea of sleep, then back again to the shore of waking, until finally the tide takes you out into dream. There is nothing you need to do. Only trust the tide. Only allow your breath to carry you. If thoughts come, let them float like driftwood. They do not need to be gathered. They will pass on their own. And as they drift, you remain here, calm, quiet, breathing with history. You have walked with us through Montmartre, where artists once mixed paint and powder in the same cafés. You have lingered in salons where elegance hid dependence behind silk curtains. You have seen the chemist at his bench, believing he was offering healing. You have watched the city dim its lamps and fall into silence. All of these voices, all of these places now settle like dust. They do not demand your attention anymore. They have told their part, and they grow quiet as you grow quiet. If there is one thread in all of this, it is that people endure. Fragile, yes. Confused, often, but still enduring. The stories of Paris are not just about medicine or law or crime. They are about survival, about men and women finding ways to keep breathing, even when the air grew heavy. And so, as you lie here now, you are part of that thread. You too endure. You too breathe. And that is enough. If you have found calm here, if these stories have eased your night, I invite you gently. Leave a quiet sign of presence, a like. Leave a trace of where you are listening from, so that across the world others may see we share the night together. And if you wish to return, subscribe, and let this channel be a place where history meets rest. It is not a demand, only an invitation. Take it if it feels right, or simply breathe and let it pass. Now let your eyes close if they are not already closed. Let the sounds around you soften into nothing. Imagine the Seine at night, slow and endless, carrying its reflections under the bridges of Paris. Imagine the lanterns guttering out one by one until the city sleeps entirely, and you too may sleep. The past is safe, the present is calm, the future can wait. Breathe in, breathe out, rest. The streets of Paris are empty now. The shutters are closed, the lamps extinguished. the river moving in its patient rhythm. The voices we followed, artists, aristocrats, chemists, children, have all grown silent. Their stories float behind us like distant echoes, fading further with every breath you take. The city is at rest, and so are you. Breathe in, breathe out. Again, breathe in, breathe out. With each breath, the weight of the world loosens. With each breath, the stories dissolve into dream. Above you, the sky stretches wide, scattered with faint stars. Some burn bright, some flicker faintly, but all are constant. They have looked down on revolutions, on salons, on markets, on families at their tables. They look down on you now, and they offer only silence. Below you, the earth holds you gently. It has carried all who came before, and it carries you. You need not move. You need not hold anything. You are already held. Around you, the night wraps close. The air is soft. The sounds are distant. Even your thoughts begin to sound far away, like bells muffled by fog. Imagine the Seine once more. The water moves under bridges, slow and dark. Each ripple carries a fragment of history, a laugh from Montmartre, a sigh from a salon, the hush of a chemist's bench, the whisper of a child waiting at a door. The river gathers them all, carries them out to sea, and lets them go. So too with your mind. Every thought, every memory, every worry can be set upon the water. The river takes it. The river carries it. The river releases it into silence. The story is over. The city is still. The breath is steady. You are free to let go. You are free to rest. You are free to sleep. And when morning comes, history will still be here. The stories will wait. But for now, the night is yours. If you wish to return, you may. If you wish to listen again, you may. Silent history will always be waiting, a quiet voice in the dark. But tonight, let the last words be these. Close your eyes. Rest your body. Trust the night. Good night. Thank you for listening to Silent History. If these stories have brought you calm, I invite you to leave a quiet like, share where you're watching from, and subscribe so you can return here whenever you need rest. Until next time, breathe deeply, let go of the day, and allow history to guide you into sleep. Good night.